Welcome to Lost Relation Chronicles.
My name is Alistair White. I'm 45 and currently going through a divorce. I have two adult children, aged 22 and 20 at the time this all unfolded, and let me tell you, I was not in a good place when it happened. It was a Saturday, and since I wasn't working, I decided to help my wife, Laura, with the housework since she wasn't feeling well. I vacuumed the family room, unloaded the dryer, and was in the middle of transferring laundry from the washer to the dryer when I accidentally knocked over the trash can in the laundry room. After muttering a few choice words, I started cleaning up the mess when I came across something that left me stunned. A couple of used protection. I was shocked, furious, and completely at a loss. Laura and I hadn't used protection in over 15 years. Back then, we only used them briefly when she had developed a yeast infection. Besides, I had a vasectomy 18 years ago, so there was no need for any other form of birth control. Our kids hadn't visited us in weeks, so I immediately ruled out the possibility that they were responsible. The discovery left me reeling. I wasn't sure exactly what I was going to do, but I knew I had to do something. My first decision was to leave, at least for a little while. I headed into the bedroom and grabbed a suitcase, making sure not to wake Laura. She really was unwell, and despite how angry I was, I couldn't ignore the fact that I still loved her. I quietly packed enough clothes to last me a few days. Then I went back to the kitchen, took the protection and my wedding ring, and placed them on the table. After a deep breath, I sat down and wrote Laura a note, pouring out everything I was feeling. It said, "Laura, what you see on the table represents what remains of our marriage. I'm deeply sorry if I wasn't enough for you. I never realized you felt the need for something beyond us. I'm leaving for a few days to think and decide what I'm going to do next. Please don't try to contact me during this time. I will reach out when I'm ready to talk. If you choose not to tell the kids what's happened and they ask me, I won't hold anything back. The same applies to our parents. I ask one thing of you. Please take the time to truly consider how much this has hurt me. When we talk, I will expect honest answers. Some of my questions will be difficult, not because you won't know the answers, but because I will insist on hearing them, even if it's hard for you to say. If you don't want to answer them when the time comes, just tell me. I won't allow this betrayal to continue. If you're unwilling to end your relationship with your lover, let me know when I reach out. If that's the case, I'll step away from your life. Lastly, this act has not only defiled our marriage, but also our home. If we're to rebuild, selling this house will be necessary. Despite everything, I still love you. But this is a nearly fatal wound to our marriage. Alistair." I loaded up my truck and drove away, possibly for the last time. The weight of everything hit me hard, and I had to pull over several times to wipe my eyes and regain composure. I wasn't paying much attention to where I was going at first, but I eventually realized I was heading toward the cabin my grandfather had left me. It was the perfect retreat. No phone, no cell service, and no internet. A place where I could think clearly and sort through my emotions. Without hesitation, I turned off my cell phone and kept driving. For the next 3 weeks, the cabin became my refuge. I stayed there, except for going to work, and made it clear to my workplace that I wasn't taking any non-business calls. During my lunch breaks in town, I took steps to protect myself financially. I moved some of the money from our joint savings into separate accounts to ensure at least half of it would be secure. Laura hadn't worked in years, so I knew that if we ended up divorcing, it would be costly for me. Thankfully, my grandfather's trust fund and the cabin were protected assets, giving me some peace of mind. After weeks of reflection, the raw intensity of my emotions began to settle, and I made my decision. On my way back toward town, I turned my phone back on once I got within range. When I checked my messages, I saw missed calls from about 10 different people. In addition to Laura, there were calls from my kids, our minister, both sets of parents, and a few numbers I didn't recognize. Finally ready to confront what awaited me, I dialed home. When Laura answered the phone, I asked her directly if she was ready to answer my questions truthfully. Her response was immediate and unexpected. She burst into sobs, telling me that the police had been looking for me as a missing person and had questioned her to see if she'd harmed me. I waited for her to calm down, but when she finally stopped rambling, I repeated my question. Was she ready to give me honest answers? Instead of answering, she started babbling again. Frustrated and unable to get through to her, I hung up the phone. Next, I called my kids. Ethan, my eldest, answered. His first question stunned me. He wanted to know what I had done to make me run away. I was taken aback and asked him if that's what Laura had told him. When he confirmed, I told him that if he believed it, there was no point in continuing the conversation. I then explained to him what I had found in the trash that day and asked if he or his sister, Megan, had been to the house that week. He said he hadn't been there and wasn't sure about Megan. He mentioned that the last time he'd spoken with her, she had just broken up with her boyfriend and hadn't been seeing anyone since. Ethan's tone was cautious, but I could sense he was trying to piece everything together as much as I was. I called Megan next, and her response was nearly identical to Ethan's. It became clear that Laura hadn't told either of them the truth about what was going on, which only reignited my anger. Determined to set the record straight, I called the police station. I informed them that I had never been missing, explaining that I hadn't been in contact with my wife due to serious personal issues between us. When I mentioned that Laura knew I wasn't missing, they told me that she had filed the report herself. They said they would review the situation and consult the prosecutor about the possibility of filing charges for a false police report. After dealing with the police, I called both sets of parents. My parents, as I expected, supported me wholeheartedly. Laura's parents, on the other hand, immediately accused me of lying and berated me for hurting Laura. Their hostility didn't surprise me, but it was still exhausting. By then, I'd had enough. I made a stop at my boss's house, handed him my resignation, and let him know I was taking time to focus on personal matters. With that done, I headed back toward the cabin. Before I could get out of cell range, Laura called. I pulled over and answered. Her tone was calmer now, and she simply asked when I planned to come home. Still fuming over being painted as the bad guy, I answered her firmly. I will come back to your love nest when, and only when, you tell everyone the truth. I will not be made the villain here. I didn't cheat on you. Those protection weren't mine, and I will not accept that house as my home anymore. Laura sniffled on the other end before asking in a shaky voice, "Where have you been? Why haven't you come home?" "Why?" I cut her off. "It is not my home anymore, Laura. Get that through your head. You don't need to know where I've been because you gave up the right to know when you cheated. I quit my job today," I continued. "So, you won't be able to call me there. And where I'm headed now, you don't need to find me. I'm not coming back." Taking a breath, I added, "You should probably file for divorce because you can't sell the house without my signature, and I won't be paying the mortgage or utilities anymore." I waited for her response, but there was only silence on the line. Then the sound of a dial tone. With that, I shut off my phone, got back on the road, and drove straight toward the cabin. On the way, I stopped at the diner in the small village near the cabin for supper. After eating, I headed to the cabin, where I settled in for the night. The next morning, I drove back to the village and stopped at the local post office to rent a P.O. box and update my mailing address. While in town, I noticed that our bank had a branch there, so I went in, identified myself, and informed them that I would be managing my accounts from their location moving forward. With those tasks handled, I called a close friend of mine who happens to be an attorney. I explained the situation and everything I had done so far. He assured me that I had taken the right steps to protect myself and advised me to keep documenting everything. An idea struck me, so I decided to call one of our neighbors, a well-known busybody. I asked if she'd noticed any unfamiliar cars at the house recently. She eagerly shared that a bright red, flashy sports car had been parked in our driveway several times, often staying for hours at a time. She didn't know the make or model, but mentioned the car had a vanity license plate reading, Christ's number 1. I thanked her and then asked if she'd be willing to leave me a message on my cell phone if the car appeared again. Knowing her fondness for gossip, I figured she'd not only comply, but that the story would soon spread throughout the neighborhood. Remembering that the minister had called, I decided to return his call. When he answered, I asked what he wanted when he called earlier. Without missing a beat, he asked why I had abandoned my wife. I couldn't help but laugh before replying, "Why don't you tell me about your red Corvette? When was the last time you paid her a visit?" There was a long silence on the line before I heard the unmistakable click of a dial tone. Next, I called Laura. I told her she could leave messages on my cell phone, and I'd respond when I was back in range. Before hanging up, I added one parting shot. "By the way, Laura, is the minister's tool better than mine?" There was a sharp gasp, a choked sob, and then silence as the call disconnected. After that, I called my lawyer again and updated him on the situation. I explained the neighbor's observations about the minister's red Corvette, how both he and Laura reacted to my pointed questions, and how all signs seemed to point to him being the unknown depositor of the protection. I then instructed my lawyer to file for a legal separation citing adultery as the reason, and to also prepare divorce papers naming the minister as a correspondent. I reasoned that filing both would offer Laura a choice. She could either contest the divorce or accept the separation, which she couldn't fight. My lawyer agreed and assured me the paperwork would be handled promptly. I wasn't entirely prepared for the fallout my actions caused, though I wasn't surprised, or unhappy, for that matter. Our busybody neighbor wasted no time spreading the story about the red Corvette. and since several church deacons lived nearby, it didn't take long for the minister to face the consequences. He was swiftly fired. As for Laura, things spiraled even further. She turned out to be pregnant, was arrested for filing a false police report, and later suffered a miscarriage. Meanwhile, my son Ethan initially took Laura's side, which only fueled my anger. After I ignored his calls for over a month, he finally reached out using Megan's phone. When he told me Laura had admitted the truth, I felt a mix of vindication and lingering bitterness. Raw from the whole ordeal, I couldn't resist delivering a jab. I told Ethan that I was still furious and, in a moment of cruel spite, mentioned that I was going to get DNA tests from him and Megan to confirm their paternity. I even added that, if it turned out they weren't mine, I would sue their biological father for back child support. My words cut deep. Ethan broke down in tears and hung up. Of course, I knew the kids were mine, thanks to DNA testing the school required for a health program years ago. Still, I was so emotionally raw that I lashed out, punishing Ethan for siding with his mother. Realizing I'd gone too far, I called Megan and explained what I'd said. I also asked her to encourage Ethan to call me again so I could apologize properly. The prosecutor dropped the charges against Laura after I requested it, a small act of mercy on my part, though it didn't erase the pain of everything that had happened. Laura, realizing the inevitable, signed the divorce papers. She moved out of town, likely to escape the reputation that followed her actions, and perhaps to start anew somewhere far from the mess she'd created. As for me, I took a few deep breaths and started the process of moving forward. I moved back into the house, but things were different now. I couldn't just continue living in the same space without making some changes. The emotional weight of the past lingered in every corner, so I decided to make a fresh start in my own way. I got new beds for all the bedrooms, symbolic of wiping the slate clean. It was a simple change, but it gave me a sense of control, something I hadn't felt in a long time. Megan, who had always been the responsible and nurturing one, decided that I wasn't going to be left alone in my recovery. She suggested I needed a housekeeper to help with the daily chores, something I hadn't even thought about. She moved back into the house to oversee things and make sure I didn't go down the same self-destructive path that I had in the past. Megan never did date again. When I asked her if she had thoughts about finding someone, she looked at me and simply said that no one could ever measure up to the kind of man she wanted. No one is as good as my daddy, she told me one evening. It struck me in a way I hadn't expected. On one hand, it made me proud, but on the other, it also reminded me of the responsibility I had to be the man I wanted her to see, the one who deserved to be admired. Then, out of the blue, my old boss called. It had been a while since we'd spoken, and I hadn't expected to hear from him. He offered me a promotion, a new position with a significant increase in responsibility, and the best part was that it allowed me to telecommute. It felt like a lifeline, a fresh opportunity to take control of my career without sacrificing my personal life. The flexibility would allow me to be there more for Megan and to keep the space I'd carved out for myself after everything that had happened. Life was slowly starting to feel good again. I had my health, my family, and the chance to rebuild in ways I hadn't even imagined. The pain was still there, but I was learning to manage it, to not let it define me anymore. The future looked brighter than it had in a long time. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.